Good morning, everyone, and hello. I think we have all our participants joining, and I see all our panel is on board. I would like to welcome you to this webinar, and thank you for participating in what promises to be an interesting discussion on urban governance with the authors of papers from the South African Cities Network Urban Governance Paper Series, Vol.1, which we are launching today as part 2 of a launch. Part 1 was held a couple of months ago. My name is Danga Muwowo. I am the Program Manager for Well-Governed Cities at the South African Cities Network. Just before we get started, I believe all the participants' microphones are on mute, but if I can also ask the panelists and the paper presenters to put your microphone on mute when you're not speaking. There is a chat bar in the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we are encouraging discussion. We'd like to engage with you as participants. So if you would please, even as the authors are presenting their papers, enter questions into the chat bar, and myself and my colleague who's co-hosting, who's assisting me, will be looking out for your questions and directing them to the author's attention. We will also have time for discussion at the end of the presentation, so you can also raise questions at that time. If I could also ask my colleague now to paste the link to the urban governance papers in the chat box. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to see the papers yet, you can see them. That would be great. Thank you. The South African Cities Network's Well-Governed Cities program considers how South African cities are governed, that's the metros, and whether the political and institutional context is stable, open, and dynamic enough to accommodate varied societal objectives and interests. Government is the vehicle through which these interests are pursued, while governance refers more broadly to the multiplicity of arrangements within which elected leaders, societal actors, and service providers arrange and become part of a system. The aim of the Urban Governance Paper Series, therefore, is to explore different issues that affect the ability of cities to deliver on their mandate, ranging from institutional strength and capacity to financial management and administrative efficiency, but also people, power, and politics. The first volume of the series contains 8 papers covering 4 broad governance themes. The first, positive rights and service delivery. The second, democracy, participation, and human rights. The third, administration, finance, and government. And the last being the private sector and innovation. And today we're fortunate to have 3 paper authors with us to present their papers and engage with us on them. On positive rights and service delivery, local government is where citizens engage most intimately with the state, and most frequently as well, through things like electricity, water, sanitation, and waste and removal. Sam Kummer's paper, The Progressive Realization of Socioeconomic Rights, examines the extent to which cities have realized the socio-economic rights enshrined in the Constitution, based on various judgments that have clarified the responsibility of cities. In the area of accountability, democracy, and participation, a key element of developmental local government, as envisioned in the 1998 white paper, is the participation of communities in developing the plans and in engaging in the better world that they would like to create for themselves. Kevin Foster's paper, South Africans' Tools for Urban Public Participation, diagnoses the shortcomings of current public participation processes used by municipalities and describes some innovative procedural methods and technology-based tools that can result in meaningful public participation. And in the area of administration, finance, and governing, the relationship between politicians and administrators is an important contributing factor to the ability of cities to deliver on their mandate of providing services to citizens and long-term urban policy goals such as spatial transformation. In his paper, Power Dynamics in Municipal Governance, Insights from the City of Johannesburg, Letu Masango uses a case study of the ANC's Regional Economic Transformation Committee in Johannesburg to develop an understanding of the relationship between city politicians and administrators, and offers some lessons for the future of urban governance. And now for the paper presentations themselves, if we could start with you, Sam, over to you.
Thank you, Danga. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks, Danga, for affording us this opportunity to be part of this dialogue that pertains to our paper series. So my paper delves into the whole notion of to what extent are the cities able to progressively realize socioeconomic rights. Socioeconomic rights pertain to, first, uh, looking at the constitutional court judgments, which pertains to what extent were the cities able to cater for the provision of access to adequate housing. So the paper, second slide, please. Oh, yes. The structure of the presentation, in short, I'll look at the introduction, the mandate of cities, the findings of the courts, there are 13 constitutional court judgments regarding the provision of access to adequate housing. I will not go into all the 13 constitutional judgments. I will just tease out what came out of these particular findings in terms of implications that they have for housing policies for our cities and to a larger extent municipalities. And lastly, looking at conclusion and recommendation. So part of the introduction is to say that the purpose of this paper is to examine, as I said earlier, the 13 constitutional court judgments regarding the provision of access to adequate housing, which has to do with Section 26 of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, and the first landmark case being the famous case. In this regard, the Constitutional Court ruled that the state is obliged to ensure that people have adequate access to housing and other services necessary to realize their socioeconomic rights. So it was the first time the Constitutional Court was given an opportunity to properly interpret the Bill of Rights in relation to socioeconomic rights. In this instance, access to adequate housing. And also providing clarity in terms of how to ensure that the realization of the socioeconomic rights progressively extended to the needy, the vulnerable, and the marginalized section of the population. Who are these? These largely are people who are living in informal settlement dwellings, homeless individuals, most parts of the country and within the jurisdiction of municipalities. So the Bill of Rights in our constitution also informed, in short, by international legal documents or treaties, for example, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and also looking at some of the UN treaties, but very important in our case also, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. In addition, municipalities may be held accountable if they do not respect, promote, and fulfill socioeconomic rights. And that is the reason that most of these cases were brought by ordinary members of the public, assisted to some extent by NGOs in terms of holding these municipalities accountable through litigation, but very important, looking at the whole notion of how to provide for adequate housing or shelter for the vulnerable. The mandate of cities, one is to say that local government is the sphere of government located within communities and well placed to appropriately respond to local needs, interests, and expectations of communities, but also assuming and fulfilling this particular role and responsibility within the confines of obligations outlined or stipulated in the Constitution and other pieces of legislation, either the Municipal Systems Act, looking at the MFMA, and also looking at other applicable legislation that pertains to, for example, the role of municipalities and cities in this instance, to be able to progressively provide for basic needs and services to the local communities. So, in short, the findings of the courts, as I said, the paper examined 13 constitutional court judgments, one in the Grootboom case, and also looking at the Mazibuko case, and also the Stubert case, and also the Peku case. So these are cases that were brought by ordinary people as a result of one being evicted without being provided alternative accommodation or short-term accommodation. In other instances, they were just relocated to certain areas without having meaningful engagement with the affected parties. So since 1996, various court cases have clarified the role of the state in particular cities, which should, one, take reasonable measures, including providing short-term accommodation for those in desperate need. And two, provide alternative accommodation even when budget is lacking. So if you read the Mazibuko case against the city of Johannesburg, the court was very adamant to say an excuse cannot be provided, which has to do with lack of funding or lack of budget in terms of catering for dire needs or addressing the plight of the vulnerable, in this instance, those who happen to be homeless, but they cannot access housing, which is provided by the city. Also very important, the directive coming from the court also to say that periodically cities have to review their programs, which has to do with social service delivery provisioning, and also looking at budget provision to respond to the evolving needs of the citizens. Important also, it is important for cities to engage with citizens and use the concept of meaningful engagement. Say, even if a city were to decide to evict residents or occupiers of a particular land without obtaining a court order, there should be meaningful engagement with the affected citizens in terms of determining and also ensuring that they are provided alternative accommodation or short-term accommodation as provided for in most of judgment. So, issue of meaningful engagement with citizens, very important, and also it is important to take reasonable measures in providing short-term accommodation. Part of looking at the conclusion in a nutshell is to say, if cities are to achieve progressive realization of socioeconomic rights, they will need one strong value-based political leadership. Value-based political leadership that is considerate of the dignity of the citizens. In the case, we've witnessed that since lockdown, especially under level 3, we've seen a lot of evictions taking place in most of the cities, especially in parts of Western Cape. Knowing very well that lockdown regulations prohibit evictions of residents, in as much as they might have occupied a particular piece of land legally and all of that. So the High Court in Cape Town ruled in favor of those who were evicted in recent times, though the city is now deciding to appeal the judgment. But I'm certain that even if the matter were to be brought before the Concord will still rule in favor of the victims or the vulnerable citizens. So value-based political leadership, we think, should be a sense of consideration of the plight of the vulnerable, the marginalized section of the communities. Two very important management capabilities, not only at the strategic senior echelons of the cities, but also at the middle and lower levels of management. So those capabilities are very important, which has to do with project planning, which has to do with project implementation and also taking into account the evolving changes that are taking place within the communities in terms of their needs, in terms of their interest, in terms of their expectations, and also demands. And also very important, we need enhanced staff motivation and attitude, which has to do with how municipal staff about embedding a culture of service to the citizens. And this would also lead to new philosophies being developed, underlined service quality, innovative ways of providing basic services to the residents, a sense of agency and speed in responding to the needs, the expectations of the communities, and also excellence in how they go about providing particular services. So basically, that's part of what the paper provides for, and also looking at what could be the practical solutions that can be looked into. I thank you for your participation.
Thank you, Sam, excuse me, for your presentation. Just a reminder to participants that the bios of the speakers, the authors, are in fact in the Zoom webinar chat, so you can read those there. Next up, if I would go to Kevin, please, for your presentation. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Daniel. Let me just share my screen. Right, is that coming through? Cool. All right, thanks, Danga. Yeah, so my paper was on South Africa's tools for urban public participation, and essentially it had two purposes. Firstly, to document the state of public participation in local government in South Africa and to explore some of the reasons for its shortcomings. And this part was done primarily through a lit review, covering literature on ward committees and IDPs, ranging from around sort of 2005 to 2016. So some of it's a little bit dated, but what the more recent research suggests is that not a lot has changed. And then the second part of the paper was to explore some of the innovative tools being used for public participation in South Africa. And these have mostly come through civil society. There have been one or two innovations by local governments themselves, but it's tended to be more a civil society-led approach. But if we go to the start, why should we have public participation in any way? So coming from South Africa's context and history, the purpose of public participation could be seen as being to build inclusive citizenship by making a once exclusive state open and responsive to the needs of the majority previously excluded and discriminated against. So that's Oldfield's reasoning for why it's important. And in terms of making public participation meaningful, there are sort of two primary uses for it. To strengthen citizens' rights and voices through influence over local policy making, accountability and responsiveness of institutions, and thus allowing communities to achieve a greater degree of self-determination. And secondly, to ensure better allocation of resources at local level with decisions made in a fuller understanding of the context of communities. So bringing through local knowledge to make sure the best decisions are made given the resources available. So if we look at the state of formal public participation in local governments in South Africa, it's guided by four primary pieces of legislation: the Municipal Structures Act, the Municipal Systems Act, the Municipal Financial Management Act, and the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act. And they work through sort of two key mechanisms for, at least for planning-oriented public participation, and that's ward committees and IDPs. There's also ongoing public participation in local government on the basis of decisions made day to day. And those tend to work rather through sort of notice and comment approaches where the municipality will put out a request for comment to the public, and the public will have the opportunity to respond. But the paper focuses more on the ward committees and the IDPs. So if we look at the state of ward committees, so the research over the years has found that what we see now is that ward committees are largely established, and these are sort of generalized findings. There are areas where this is not necessarily the case, but generally ward committees are established, but they struggle for functionality. And because they struggle for functionality, they struggle to provide tangible democratic outcomes. Because those sort of tangible democratic outcomes tend to be limited to those ward committees that are functional. And functionality means the buy-in of the ward councillor, meeting regularly, making sure you're discussing the right kinds of issues, making sure the management of the ward committee works, particularly around document management and the development of a work plan. So sort of process management needs to be strong to make ward committees functional. And the findings of the literature suggest that these are the types of ward committees. The ward committees with this sort of level of functionality are the ones who really end up getting their needs met through the IDP and through other municipal planning and strategies. In 2011, the EU funded some research into ward committees in South Africa, and they found that only about 1/3 of ward committees were meeting this criteria of functionality. And the reality was that in 2/3, there were really poor levels of document management and low levels of deliberation. So the conversation, which is really the nexus of public participation around planning around the issues, was not at a level that could build substantive democratic outcomes. And there was also a low level of representation in interest groups other than having good representation of women. So issues weren't represented, and communities with more or less relative power in the municipality were not that well representative. In terms of IDPs, so the IDP experience is one where public participation has tended to be compliance oriented. So often in many municipalities, from the officials and councillors' point of view, successful public participation is judged based on turnout at meetings and that those meetings happen. And that quality of inputs in those meetings becomes a secondary consideration. And the quality of those inputs largely depends on facilitation, and that's highly variable and often depends on the skills of the councillors and officials presiding. So if you have a weak councillor, you may struggle to have strong facilitation of IDP public participation processes. So we end up with a sort of superficial state of public participation where administrators can consider their public participation obligation fulfilled if they can demonstrate that they've met with the public, but what substance is that really providing? And so we get this situation where IDP public participation ends up in these what officials call wish lists of inputs, and what you don't get is real influence from the community on policy making, on actual decisions around resource allocation, and you don't get accountability. So this suggests that the approach requires revising in order to deepen the level of engagement by having more discussions and decisions that affect communities and better information sharing between government and communities. So if we then look a bit closer at what the barriers in these two mechanisms are to effectiveness of public participation, what we see is that ward committees are largely designed around the ward councillor. The ward committee legally can only make recommendations to the councillor. The councillor chairs the meetings, is responsible for making sure the agenda is set and sort of acts as the conduit of information between the ward committee and the council. So a lot depends on the ward councillor himself. So if he either doesn't trust his committee or his committee doesn't trust him, there's the possibility of ward committee effectiveness breaking down, and if he's not entirely on top of management of a ward committee, that could also risk the same happening. There's also the risk of ward committees being captured by party politics, and we've seen a lot of both inter-party competition and intra-party competition having effects on ward committee effectiveness. In terms of inter-party competition, you get things like composition bias, where the ward councillor may load a ward committee to have members of his party dominate, can manipulate the agenda to focus primarily on the things of their interest, and perhaps not on areas of concern where other parties or non-partisan participants may have more interest. And also sort of the weaponization of information, where information can be used for political purposes rather than for the purposes of the discussion at hand or the planning process that's being undertaken. In terms of intra-party competition, you see factions developing, loading in the ward committee of a particular faction, and purging of members from other factions in parties. Also, ward committees and IDP meetings rely on municipal council and administration. So the quality of the municipal council and the administration, the quality of their administration of these processes is a big factor in their functionality. They're reliant on the administration for logistics, for administrative support, for financial support, for document management, and for training. So if your training doesn't enable your ward committee or your community members to participate in a forum at the level required, you're going to struggle to see effective public participation through these mechanisms, and facilitation of this as well. If your facilitation is not particularly dynamic, if your facilitation doesn't evenly distribute power within the forum, so that people can trust each other and feel like they have agency, you're going to also struggle to get effective public participation through that. And the fact that it all relies on the council administration perhaps adds to that being a barrier. So given these factors, there are these formal processes run the risk of being non-representative, are subject to political sea changes, and are reliant on the authority that communities are supposed to negotiate with, creating a bit of a potential conflict there. So what other tools for public participation have been tried in South Africa? So we've seen a couple of instances of participatory budgeting being experimented with. Participatory budgeting is a form of participation focused on allocating resources available for a local government or a community, and it kind of has 5 characteristics. Funding decisions that are made formally and binding, or credibly committed, and are credibly committed to by local government officials. Decisions are open to all members of the community. The process includes public discussion, public reasoning. Spending ideas and priorities come from members of the public rather than from officials, and members of the public are involved in the design and implementation of the projects and can hold officials accountable for implementation. So we've seen a couple of instances of this being tried. Plan Act led a process that tried it in Mikado, local municipality, and the Social Justice Coalition has tried a process in Cape Town. In Mikado, what happened was Plan Act took a tool to the communities, trained them, explained ideas of performance monitoring, explained how prioritization occurs, explained the way resources need to be distributed throughout a municipality rather than just the local ward, and sort of led a facilitated process where a community could engage and engage in budgeting in a much deeper way. They were also then able to bring the local government on board to engage as well, and could get sort of tangible budgetary outcomes based on that engagement. In Cape Town, the situation was a little bit different. The SJC led started, I think, in 2014 for the city's 2015 budget processes, led a budgeting workshop or a budget camp, and trained sort of 500 residents of Khayelitsha, or more than 500 residents of Khayelitsha in participatory budgeting, and 500 residents of Khayelitsha wrote individual submissions to the city's budget process, which overwhelmed the city's typical public participation process and their ability to respond to these submissions, which they need to do individually in terms of PUDGA. Which goes to show that sort of the level of participation cities are expecting to a certain extent, given that a city like Cape Town has 3-4 million people, but they struggle to deal with submissions of 500, or at least did 5 years ago. That capacity has increased more recently, particularly given the overwhelming responses they received around drought levies a couple of years ago. But I'll touch more on that later. So that's participatory budgeting. Social audits are another one, and this particularly is a way of bringing participation into performance management, which is also required in the Municipal Systems Act. And a social audit is a community-led process of reviewing official documents to determine whether the public expenditure and other service delivery outcomes reported by government really reflect public money spent and the services received by the community. A social audit approach offers two specific benefits. It enables citizens to engage meaningfully in assessing the quality of basic services that they are provided with compared with what was planned. And it's also an excellent tool for understanding local conditions, which will lead to better resource allocation. So we've seen at least a couple of examples of this. Also, one by Plan Act again in Ekurhuleni, where they, in 3 informal settlements, conducted social audits of sanitation facilities, if I remember correctly, that a service provider was providing, and were able to get the Metro to take note of the social audit findings, get the Metro to use the social audit findings in further decision making, and get the Metro to share their own information about the contracts that they were providing, that they were making to provide for the sanitation in Ekurhuleni. Ndifuna and Kwazi and SJC have also done something similar in Cape Town and a couple of informal settlements, Wolverine being one of them. However, their engagement with the city has been far more fraught, with less information sharing, less engagement between the cities and the SJC and Ndifuna and Kwazi. They have a fairly fraught relationship. And other tools for public participation that we've seen experimented with, we've seen web platforms experimented with. Dear South Africa is an interesting example where the founders of that have built a website which leverages on cities' own public participation input opportunities, particularly for notice and comment procedures. So a city may have a web-based platform where someone can make an input or a submission on something that they've published. Dear South Africa built their own platform which linked into those systems and then heavily marketed them on Facebook. And a good example here is the Cape Town drought levy, where they managed to get over 60,000 responses through leveraging social media to get people to go to the website to put in a response, which the kind of response that someone like the City of Cape Town never sees, where they expect maybe 500 to 800 responses per request for comment. So a real sort of eye opener in terms of what's possible if it's done differently.
Sorry, Kevin, if I could ask you to start wrapping up, please.
Sure.
Thanks.
Okay, yeah, but the key things to learn about this is it's important that local government put in place appropriate project management if they want to pursue this, have a high level of skilled leadership, and have appropriate contracting arrangements to avoid wasteful and overspecified tenders. The usability and usefulness of these systems also need to be tested with the users. And we've seen a bit in terms of mobile applications, similar experiments, and the learnings are more or less the same when it comes to engaging with mobile platforms as well. We've seen bulk SMS used. Mandela.mobi is an organization which is using mobile platforms to run petitions. Some municipalities have their own apps, and Grassroots, another organization that has built tools to try and engage public participation. But the key learning from here is that these things fail when, for a lot of the same reasons that other public participation may fail. they're dependent on the council to support the system properly. They're dependent on the ward councillor buying into the system. So the thing is to really notice that to get public participation right, regardless of what tools you want to use, you've got to have a well-resourced and engaged local government behind that. So in conclusion, there are no shortcuts, but new tools can offer better ways to results, or offer ways to better results. But administrators need to pay attention, and they need to find ways of building trust in particular between the administration communities, and share information and trust each other's information, rather than letting these things fall prey to destructive politics and administrators operating in a way that doesn't give the community's voice. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Kevin. And then if we could go last but not least, Letu, if we could ask you to share your presentation with us, please.
Okay, Kevin's done.
And while Letu's setting up, just a reminder to participants to please engage. You can enter your questions in the Q&A bar. I think initially I suggested the chat bar, but in the Q&A bar at the bottom of your screen to enter questions that you would like our panelists to respond to.
Great. Thank you so much, Danga. Hello to everyone online. Sorry, I'm just trying to increase. Okay. Jeez. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, great. Thank you so much for the opportunity. My paper was on the power dynamics in municipal governance and drawing on insights from the City of Johannesburg's Economic Transformation Committee. So the objectives of the paper were really just to try and get into the belly of the beast and understand the power dynamics that exist within municipal governance, and illustrating obviously through the Economic Transformation Committee how the political and administrative power dynamics have unfolded. And really at the back of my mind was always this question whether political authorities should have a greater say in the running of the administration. And how I went about the paper, it was a bit of desktop research just to get my theoretical bearings in place. But more than anything, it was actually reflections from 12 years of being a public servant, and 11 of those were actually in a political office as the chief of staff in the specific departments that I was in, economic development, development planning, and housing. So really having had the opportunity to interact with the political component as well as the administration, it was that sort of reflection. But obviously went back again and had a number of interviews with participants who were on the Economic Transformation Committee of the ANC, as well as some senior officials in the city of Joburg who were responsible for some of the departments that I was interested in, just to get a bit more detail. So I think what was quite important from the onset for me was just framing my paper in the context of bureaucrats, politicians, but more importantly in what South Africa strives to be, in that it's a developmental state. And what a developmental state does, obviously trying to put economic development as a top priority for government, and the resultant designs around policy and intervention that the government then unfolds afterwards. There are two schools of thought around developmental states, political and economic. And for this paper, I was a lot more focused on the political angle, purely just to get into this two themes around context, what gives rise to a developmental economy, and as well as agency, and how the different actors in the development state ought to function. I'm not going to get into the theoretical components. I'm sure you've had the chance to read the paper, where I highlight just using the East Asian development tigers as a clear example of what South Africa aspires to, and what would be an ideal model in that regard. But just in terms of South Africa and its development state, I mean, it's something that dates back to the '98 white paper on local government, where it really enjoys the local authority to maximize social development and economic growth, looking at issues of integration and coordination, leading and learning, as well as democratizing development, as Kevin has indicated in his paper. Getting into the city of Joburg, there have been 4 political terms since the first local government elections in 2000. And I particularly highlighted Mayor Masondo's term between 2000 and 2011, just because of the complexities that were at play at that point in time. 6 years into democracy, there was a lot of tensions, obvious tensions between an incoming political party in the form of the ANC, as well as entrenched city practices, city practitioners who had been in the city for in some instances, several decades, and in comes a new political administration, a Black-led political party, and there were obvious struggles. So I just referenced Bill over there, just talking about just these complexities and the struggles that the administration had to deal with. But at the same time, the city of Joburg instituted the performance-based contracting for senior management, which was really the opportunity for the ANC to be able to appoint its own administrators, the city managers, the executive directors, and in some instances, directors of different departments. And the city actually moved to a performance-based fixed-term contracting for all of these senior management positions. And again, the intention was also to rid the city of the permanent senior management and what was called the old guard, in the sense of these practitioners or bureaucrats that had been in the city for some time, and to be able to usher in a new set of bureaucrats who would understand the political mandate and be able to deliver on. And obviously the city then made use of the Economic Employment Equity Act, just to try and ensure that representation within the municipality was balanced. So the Employment Equity Forum was one that was quite active in Mayor Masondo's time and leading into 2016 local term of office. So fast forward a couple of months later, from 2011 to the ANC really now rethinking and realizing that it needed a policy shift in terms of how it had carried out service delivery and where it stood. I mean, there was a deep realization that that inequality had not been addressed. There was a deep understanding that the ANC was losing ground, both with the national elections and gradually with all of the different local authorities that were where the ANC was losing numbers at the polls. And the party realized that in order to remain relevant, the ANC needed to exercise greater political and strategic oversight on municipalities. And to do this, they introduced the Economic Transformation Committee. So it's a national body with the specific objective of oversight and accelerate economic transformation, and as well as changing the structure of the economy. So the Joburg ETC really took shape following what the national ETC was trying to do, and some of the resolutions that were passed at the inaugural Joburg ETC committee was the issue around identify supply chain management challenges within the city, talking to the issue of township economy, reservation of state contracts for SMMEs, and again, disrupting the monopolies and affecting identified sectors. Really all targeting the different city departments and to see what the ANC could be able to move within each of these entities as well as city departments. And there were some early successes. I mean, the ETC was able to make a solid submission to the ANC National General Council in 2015, as well as changes to the preferential procurement policy framework. And a lot of the programs that the city was running at that point in time were actually filtered through the ETC and or communicated to residents on the ground through ANC structures, through the council meetings that would be facilitated throughout the townships and other nodes in the city. But very quickly after that, though, there was very clear evidence that things were not going according to plan. And so we started off initially seeing that the ETC was really well received among city departments, but somehow it became undermined. And one of the classic examples, and excuse me, it's actually supposed to say ETC 2016 strategic planning session. We had attendance by a couple of deputy ministers, one minister, a few members of parliament, and the national chair of the ETC, Godongwana, was in attendance. And at this session, the Joburg was meant to present its economic transformation strategy. And the two departments that were tasked with pulling together that strategy, namely the heads of economic development and one other department, didn't make it to the session. And so you had all these high-ranking officials within the ANC really debating issues and realizing that a lot of the work that was being put forward is actually being undermined by the administration. So there was a real display of power dynamics and some early resistance to what the ANC was trying to push forward. And in engaging with some of the colleagues post the 2016 local government, a lot of the sentiments were that the cadre deployment has failed, and although the ETC was put forward as a structure meant to drive economic transformation, it became a hijacked platform where some individuals were using it for their own personal gain and patronage politics to drive further corrupt activities. But there was also a clear understanding, whether people were in support or against the ETC, that the ANC was really losing the fight against its ability to transform the cities, but also in its ability to manage senior officials, because a lot of the senior officials that rebuked and didn't attend these sessions were actually appointed by the very ANC. So there was internal fight back, not that it was just the old guard that was resisting the ANC, but deployees of the ANC. So just speeding along, I'm sorry, mindful of time as well. So just looking at some of the other or theoretical underpinnings of where I believe that the ETC failed, and it's in relation to issues such as agency and misrepresented bureaucracy. And there, it's really about ETC members, although acknowledging that a lot of the ANC deployees were in office, but that there's a lot of managerial positions that the ANC was not able to be in control of, that were stifling policy changes. So you have great policy being thought and developed. When it gets to the administration, it's completely stifled. The willingness of officials to adhere to political directives were clearly a big issue. But again, I must stress this point that it's not that the ANC was a constant victim in this case. One of the areas where the ANC clearly did not thoroughly think about was this issue of around management tools that were in place. So in 2016 and 2006 and 2011, you had that very strong administrative as well as performance-based system. Post that, the city thought that it wanted to realize some savings in the bill, and did away with contract-based employment and moved a lot of people to being permanent. And in that, they lost a very important lever that they used to ensure service delivery and the performance of municipal officials. And you had a situation where the reward system that went with the performance-based system was taken away, and people could do as they wish. They are impermanent and up to date. I've never heard of any employee in the city that was dismissed for poor performance. Again, there's a huge disjunction between policy and political leadership. Just quickly outlining here that what happens at ANC political policy level is very different and somewhat disjunction to what happens at an administrative level. So you've got the local government elections manifesto, the 2012 ANC elective conference with its own set of recommendations and resolutions, the 2013 list conference, the 2014 elections manifesto campaign. All of these are actual stop-start sessions that disrupt the normal operating of government. And in each of the government activities on a yearly basis, you're having to think about these new elements or new resolutions that are coming in. So quickly, in conclusion, one of the things that I looked into was this issue of the degrees of control between politicians and bureaucrats. And you've got this ideal scenario of complementary, where politicians respect the administration and the administrators are aligned to what the politicians want. But I don't believe that is the case. The relationship is not as straightforward as that if we respect each other, that there's common agenda. It was very clear that in terms of the ETC, it wasn't taken very seriously either by the political leadership, because there were strifes there as well as within the administration. And it was also possible that there's a lot of policy fatigue, as I've demonstrated in the previous slide, that you're moving from 20 different activities and you're still having to deliver services and be strategic at the same time. and obviously the issue of the non-functional management system in the form of a performance-based contract. And in going forward, I think it's an area that we clearly need to be a lot more robust about and open around, because a lot of the time we tend to look at very comforting words such as teamwork and complementarity, whereas it's not a true reflection of what's happening. You know, it's the collaboration and professionalism exists very much in an gender-filled environment that is highly conflict and hierarchical, and you've got agency elements which basically are still at play. You still don't have the right players with the right orientation, whether they are within the ANC or still part of the old guard. Those are still issues that are at play. And although the NDP has indicated that it believes that there's enough balance in terms of demographics, I think, yes, you may achieve a balance in demographics, but you need to be very clear about the agency and of the bureaucracy and the people that you have who are driving transformation in the cities. And this is obviously a very important element in the context of coalition governments that South Africa is clearly headed towards. Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, colleagues.
Great, thanks Letu for an interesting presentation that I think caps off the other two presentations we had previously. The first from Sam being perhaps the normative guidelines that we'd like to see, and then followed up by some of the engagements with citizens from Kevin, and then finally the view from the administration and the government itself in terms of implementing those desires. Before our time is actually about to run out, so what I would want to draw people's attention to is that there is an evaluation form that has been posted into the chat. If you would please fill out the evaluation form, this helps us to address some of your concerns, perhaps any advice you may have for making future sessions more interesting, perhaps more relevant. Any input you may have, that would be much appreciated. I do see that there were a few questions raised in the Q&A, which had in fact been answered by our panelists, so thank you for those. And the other thing, just in concluding, I don't know if there's any closing remarks perhaps that our panelists would like to make, perhaps based on the inputs that we received during the course of the webinar, and or perhaps any thoughts as we move into a local government election in next year. Perhaps I'll start with you, Sam, if there's any concluding remarks you'd like to make.
Oh yeah, thank you, Dana. Thank you, colleagues. I did receive one question on the Q&A regarding the latest development in the Buffalo City, where citizens were also evicted, went to court. The court granted an order that allowed the Buffalo City Metro to provide an alternative accommodation to these evictees within a period of 10 days. The 10 days has elapsed and nothing has happened so far. And I did indicate to King to say this is a classic example of the issue that is currently facing most of the municipalities, which borders, according to me, to arrogance, because the Constitution is very clear on the issue of provision of access to adequate housing. The Constitutional Court has settled this matter to say where eviction takes place accompanied by a court order, there should be an alternative accommodation that is provided to those affected citizens. But this is not taking place. And this has also been supported by what Minister Tito Mboweni said last week in Parliament, to say municipalities have spent 1.2 billion rand on legal fees. and a bulk or a chunk of these legal fees revolves around this issue of litigation, where is a clear process that you can only evict citizens if you have obtained a court order. But this process is bypassed, it's not taken into account, and citizens, through support from NGOs, they are able to go to the court and get relief. So I'm saying it is high time that city officials at the strategic level, including political leadership, they begin to ensure that the dignity of the homeless, the dignity of vulnerable communities is taken into account, and it's not politicized, because the court don't take into account issues of politics to say, no, this is a factional battle within a political party or political characters that are trying to capture a political campaign ahead of the 2021 election. So I agree with Kevin. I agree with Letu, also touch on the issue of professionalization. It's high time municipalities are professionalized. We get the people with the right skills, the right expertise, who respect the laws that govern local government sphere. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Any concluding remarks, Kevin, just to wrap us up?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I mean, I suppose the one interesting point that was raised in the Q&A was around public participation in COVID-19, and obviously public meeting has become a massive challenge in a socially distancing world. Yeah, and I'm not entirely sure I have a really good answer for the question either. There are tools and technologies that can help, and I think possibly a way to think about doing it is using very low data web platforms that you can interact with through cell phones, because we've got pretty good mobile penetration, and municipalities making Wi-Fi hotspots available as one means of engaging. This has been done in various forms in a number of places overseas. The Jordan Kohler paper in the Urban Governance series discusses one of these, Decidim in Barcelona. So, I mean, some people are trying some things, and there are some experimentations, and things are being learned about how this can be done. And the nice thing about Decidim in particular is it's an open source thing. So a city in South Africa could investigate it, engage with it, and start experimenting with it itself, more or less for free, assuming it can put in place the skills to do so. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And over to you, Letu, for some final concluding remarks. Perhaps you want to pick up on some of the things that have been raised, or
no concluding remarks. I was actually thinking that we've got a whole hour discussion, and no need to be alarmed when you're trying to wrap us up. So yeah, I thought that we'd still discuss. So sorry for having taken a bit of time.
Oh no, not at all. And in fact, that's the cue for me to say to thank all our participants who have seen that we only did have an hour for this presentation today, but to say that we value your engagement. Thank you for joining with us for this webinar today. And clearly, this time that we're in, this time of COVID-19, is one in which governance and governing has been topmost in people's minds, from the legislation around lockdowns, regulations around that, and to how in fact we deal with public health and how we get the economy back on track. And we will be having ongoing discussions, webinars of this sort in the weeks and months to come. So to watch this space and to watch the communications on social media, as well as our South African Citizen Network website, for further webinars around urban governance that will touch base on some of these issues that have been raised in the papers, but also others that become apparent in the weeks and months to come, particularly leading up to the local government elections scheduled for next year. So thank you again to our participants here on Zoom and the Facebook Live audience. And we look forward to having you join us for the next webinar, as I said, in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you. And thank you too to our panelists, I should not forget, for their papers, number one, and secondly, for having given the time to present to us. Sam Koma, Letu Masango, and Kevin Foster. Thanks very much. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.